Well, welcome to this first live celebrating philanthropy event in over 2 years. It's hard to believe how long it's been. I'm Susan Phillips, Graduate Supervisor of the Master of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership here in the School of Public Policy and Administration. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As settlers, as immigrants and their descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the Indigenous peoples of this land and hope for a more just future together. We hold this Celebrating Philanthropy event on the second last day of the Summer Institute. So we have our incoming students into the Master and Diploma of Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership and our returning students. And our returning students, this is actually the first time they've been able to be on campus. So it's particularly, I think, joyous for them given their patience in learning online over the past year. And students come from all across the country. They're diverse in every way. Their interests, their experience, and this is the beginning of our 10th year, our anniversary year, which we will extend over the next year of the program, and we're still unique in Canada. Our topic for today is philanthropy and climate change. What should philanthropy do for the climate? I don't need to tell you there's overwhelming evidence on climate change. It's occurring faster and more dramatically than many of us anticipated. Fires, extreme heat, floods, drought, and more. Addressing the effects of climate change and transitioning to net zero carbon economy will take philanthropy working full out in collaboration with governments and the private sector. So in this session, we ask the questions: how is philanthropy doing in Canada in regard to climate action? What more could it do, and does it need to do? And how might philanthropic institutions and individuals who want to put their philanthropy to work for climate action, how might they best have an impact? We're delighted to be joined by a diverse set of experts who will provide insights from different vantage points, and I will introduce them briefly without doing justice to them in the order they're sitting and in the order they'll present. Devika Shah is Executive Director of Environmental Funders Canada, a network of 70-plus funders working together to respond to environmental crises with ambitious and innovative solutions. She's dedicated her professional career to nurturing systems change, solutions that are grounded in regenerative economic development, in social justice, equity, and active democratic engagement. Her interdisciplinary background and experience in the nonprofit sector have sharpened her focus on advancing multi-stakeholder, community-informed solutions. Devika's held positions with Social Planning Toronto, the World Wildlife Fund, Pabina Institute, York University, and KCI Philanthropy. In these roles, she's strengthened organizational capacity in the areas of public engagement, advocacy, strategic integration, planning, fundraising, and operations. She holds a BSc from the University of Toronto and an MBA from the Schulich School of Business. Welcome, Devika. Nhattan Nguyen was born and raised in Montreal in the traditional unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation. He's second-generation Vietnamese. His family fled the aftermath of war in their country. Nhattan spent 5 years as outreach and operations coordinator with Climate Action Network, and for the past year has been operations coordinator with Indigenous Climate Action. In addition to his extensive volunteer roles, particularly related to climate and environment, Nhattan is also a freelance photographer, and he holds a bachelor's degree from McGill. And the really important part is that he is a student in the second year of the MPNL, and we always like to show off the expertise and achievements of our students. Aatif Baskanderi is CEO of the Northpine Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic institutions in Canada that's working to unlock opportunities for Canada's most underinvested and underserved communities. He's also the co-founder of Shalom Bai, an anti-racism education initiative built with his wife and health equity physician, Dr. Nazira Shafruddin, based on a documentary film about his life growing up Muslim in rural Newfoundland. The film has toured internationally, been shown at many film festivals, and won multiple awards. Aatif's interfaith efforts were recognized by being the third Canadian to be awarded Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth's Commonwealth Points of Light Award. Aatif was recently a fellow with the Energy Futures Lab, a member of Next 30 Possibility Panel in Alberta, and prior to his current role was the executive director of Startup Edmonton, the city's early stage tech outreach designer. He's had an eclectic background before that, designing smartphones at BlackBerry, researching olive farmers in Palestine, working with Engineers Without Borders in Canada. Started out as an engineer with a degree in electrical engineering and a Master of Technology Management at Memorial University, and then complemented that with a Master of Social Policy and Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome. And finally, my colleague, James Meadowcroft. James is professor in both the Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy and Administration here at Carleton, and he recently completed a 14-year term as a Tier 1 candidate research chair in Governance for Sustainable Development. Professor Meadowcroft has written widely on environmental politics and policy, national sustainable development policy, energy, and the transition to low-carbon economy. His research has been funded by many granting councils, leading foundations, and Carbon Management Canada. James is currently, and this is the role we asked him to speak about, co-research director of the Transition Accelerator, which uses a leading four-step methodology to engage diverse societal stakeholders to co-create visions of what a socially and economically desirable net future would look like and how we build out those transition pathways. He also leads Efficiency Canada, an independent pan-Canadian think tank that conducts rigorous policy analysis and mobilizes Canada's dynamic energy sector to make our country a global leader in energy efficiency. James's contributions have been acknowledged with an honorary degree from the University of Tampere in Finland. So we ask each participant to give us some opening remarks, about 8 minutes, which will really constrain them, particularly the academic among us, no doubt. Holding you to it, James. Then we'll have a discussion among us, open it to questions, and they'll have 1 minute each to make final statements. So let's start with you, Devika. Can you give us an overview of where we are with Canadian philanthropy relative to climate change and some of the underlying challenges and issues?
Sure. Is this on? Okay, thanks. Okay. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be here and to be with you. I think I'm biased, but I think the nonprofit sector and philanthropy are the best places to be because we have the most ability to be flexible and to be catalytic and to make, we have more flexibility in the way we deploy capital. So glad that you're all in this program. We need a lot of ideas right now. So I was asked to just give a bit of an overview of the state of climate philanthropy right now. But I think, just like we often, we start sessions with land acknowledgements, I think it's really important to ground a climate discussion in a little bit of truth-telling, because we have to kind of be honest about where we are in order to have any genuine optimism about what to do next. And so I think, where we are right now is that, and by the way, these are just my notes. I'm not texting or anything. I'd like to, in order to deal with the climate crisis, we have to do two things that are unprecedented in human history, which is we have to prioritize collectivism at a global scale across all societies over individualism, and we have to have an unprecedented level of coordination and like system level coordination and organization that we've never had before. And yet everything about the trajectory that we are on as a species right now is actually going in the opposite direction in both of those cases. So it's kind of depressing. And yes, government and business are doing more than they have ever done before. But the analogy is it's kind of like, you know, someone's drowning in front of you and you say to them, the lifeguard who's going to come save you is 12 hours away. But don't worry, when that lifeguard gets here, this lifeguard has had the best training ever and has the greatest flotation devices, better than ever before. But they're 12 hours away. So, you know, where we are right now, technology has not saved us. And, you know, we keep talking about technology being the future, but climate change is here and technology didn't save us. Here we are. We're at 1.3 degrees. Every 1/10 of a degree matters. And, you know, it's pretty safe to say, given the trajectory that we're on, we will exceed 1.5. This is hard to say, but this is what environmentalists say behind closed doors when they're not speaking to the public. And they say, you know, we're going to exceed 1.5. We're probably going to exceed 2. It's very depressing, and every 1/10 of a degree really makes a difference. If you look at what we're dealing with right now at 1.3 and you turn on the news, floods, wildfires, I mean, it's here. So just imagine what we're talking about when we get to 2 degrees. So with that lovely backdrop as our grounding, I think, you know, perhaps that explains some of the dismal level of philanthropic investment in tackling climate change relative to other issues. Because I think that just like everyone else, philanthropy, you know, where we're at is deep down, we all know how much of a challenge it is going to be. And perhaps the majority of us don't actually have faith in humanity to be able to solve this problem. And so, you know, just like everyone else, we've kind of resigned ourselves to accepting that climate change is going to be the new normal, just like COVID has become the new normal. We're just accepting that climate change is going to be the new normal, and then we're focusing on what are the, you know, the other areas where we can have some incremental wins and feel good about the things we're doing in the short term. That, I think, psychologically is behind a lot of what the numbers are showing. So in Canada, we don't actually have the numbers nailed down to a good degree of accuracy. It's actually become a priority of our organization to try to get some of those numbers in a Canadian context. But there are guideposts globally, like the Climate Works Foundation talks about 2% of global philanthropy being invested in climate change. They recently released a report that showed that the majority of foundation leaders are very, very worried, very scared about climate change. No matter what they're focused on, they do know that climate change is going to impact their ability to do their work. But the majority of them that don't fund in climate change, when asked why, say it's outside of our mission. You know, our mission might be serving the homeless or whatever the issue is, it's outside of our mission. So, but you know, that said, there are more and more funders turning their attention to climate change, and you're hearing all the big announcements from the ultra uber wealthy Jeff Bezos and Mackenzie Scott and Bill Gates and all those folks who are pouring lots of money now into climate change, and I'll say more on that later. In Canada, there are a handful of funders. I can list them all off for you. It's kind of in the 10 to 15 range of funders that will say, you know, climate change is our top priority, or it's kind of in the 1 to 3 top priorities. So it's not a lot, and traditionally the majority of them have focused on identifying what are those pathways, what are those solutions that are going to yield the greatest emission reductions that will get us to net zero, and then they fund the inside game around those solutions. So they fund organizations, academia, to do the research, the modeling, to actually articulate what the solution looks like. They fund organizations to be able to build up their government relations capacity, to go in and meet with bureaucrats and politicians and present the solutions, to be able to get on CBC and, you know, talk to the public about it. That's, you know, it's very much inside game. And now what's happening more recently is some of these big climate funders are starting to realize, oh, we've ignored the outside game for a very long time. And that's part of the reason why we're failing, is because we actually need to have you know, an electorate that creates boundaries for whatever politician we are facing. So whether we're facing a Justin Trudeau, or whether we're facing a Pierre Poilievre, no matter what their differences in opinion, they can only go so far if the public holds them to certain boundaries, or a Premier Wynne versus a Premier Ford, for example. So that is a trend that's really taking off. And sorry, I will say, going back to the inside game stuff, a lot of it is focused on federal policy and municipal policy, so cities and climate action. The big gap on the inside game is provincial. It's a huge, huge gap. Another welcome trend is that there are a lot of funders that are funding intersectionally. So they may not have climate as their top 1 to 3 priorities, but they are understanding now that, okay, we've got to actually integrate this into what we fund. So whether it's the community foundations looking at equity issues and going, okay, who has access to green space and who doesn't? Who has a tree canopy that cools them down and who doesn't? Who is located near toxic sites and who isn't? Like, you know, there's that lens. Health funders are starting to obviously see the implications. Arts funders are starting to ask, how can we contribute to winning hearts and minds on this issue? Youth funders, well, they have no choice because the youth won't let them not think about it, right? So, so there is that intersectional trend that's happening, and it's actually the framework behind the Canadian commitment on philanthropy, the climate change commitment on philanthropy that PFC, so Jean-Marc, as the CEO of PFC, is here. Philanthropic Foundations Canada is the home of this initiative. On purpose, because we're trying to attract the funders that don't necessarily see themselves in the environmental space. But it's all of our organizations have come together. It's an all hands on deck effort because we recognize that we have to help people see those intersections. So there is lots of momentum. Good things are happening. It's not all doom and gloom, but there are some elephants in the room. And, you know, will we be able to prevent things from getting a lot worse? I don't know. It depends. But I do know that there are 2 big elephants in the room that if left unaddressed, we will absolutely fail. And so one of them is just the idea that, you know, relying on the people with power in government and industry, relying on them to solve this problem when it is literally in their self-interest not to solve the problem is a huge mistake. And, you know, everyone in society who has power because the collective, the masses, have entered into a contract to give them that power, but that contract can change. And so if folks are banding together in new ways and shifting power, that's absolutely critical. If it doesn't happen, we will absolutely fail. And as I said, that's an area that outside game is starting to get addressed. The other one is that our current economic system makes it actually impossible to scale any of the solutions that we're now looking at. Fighting climate change actually is the one and the same as replacing unfettered capitalism with regenerative economics. Because what's the point of, you know, solutions that may reduce emissions but at the same time are literally destroying and causing us to far exceed our planetary thresholds, such that, you know, water and land and air are polluted? Either way, we're in trouble if we don't, you know, it's all integrated, right? And so you know, if you think about EVs as an example, all the green growth enthusiasts are really relying heavily on EVs as electric vehicles as a solution. But there's been a lot of research that shows that if, you know, even in high EV scenarios, you're only going to reduce emissions by about 15%. And if you add on electric bikes and non-motorized transport, it gets you to 30%. And what's the reason for the gap is that increased economic growth leads to increased energy use, and that increased energy use, you know, causes emissions to go up. I'm highly simplifying right now, but the other piece of it is, you know, all the batteries require mines to be dug up, and we are now depleting the thresholds of our existing mines and digging up new mines. So all of this, you know, EVs are a solution only when coupled. The study found that it's a solution only when coupled by a drastic reduction in demand, especially air demand, as well as a 23% decrease in the level of economic growth, that level of economic output compared to the present. So that's the reality of what we're dealing with. And, you know, every time I bring this up, I hear a lot, people say, well, you know, we're not going to take down the current economic system anytime soon. Like, I don't have time for that. I got to focus on actual, you know, realistic solutions right now. The reality is those realistic solutions are never going to get scaled up to actually be real solutions unless we choose the option of wholesale transformation. So this is where maybe I turn from a pessimist to an optimist, because, or maybe it's just that I realize we have no other way out. But we have no choice. I think philanthropy has a really critical role, which I'll speak about in the end part, to actually challenge some of those systems as we try to advance climate solutions.
Thank you, Devika. Great opening. So Nathan, I saw you shaking your head quite a bit. I don't want to brand you as the activist perspective, but you're challenging in your role many of these systems. So let's pick it up from there.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Devika, for those really important thoughts. So it's really great to be back on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I was actually here from 2016 to 2020 working with Climate Action Network. And in February 2020, I learned how to say Anibshikuinene Inda, which means I'm Asian in Anishinaabe. And that sentence literally translates to person who makes tea, which I found very endearing. And so the Anishinaabe classes that I was taking were hosted by an Indigenous youth organization called Assembly of Seven Generations. And they do amazing work with Indigenous youth in Ottawa. And through volunteering and supporting them, I got looped into the Moose Moratorium campaign that took place in September 2020. Has anyone heard of the Moose Moratorium campaign? Yeah. So in September of 2020, there are two Algonquin Anishinaabe communities about 2 hours north of Ottawa who were setting up blockades in the Virundry Park to protect the moose. They were seeing that moose numbers were dwindling in the park, partly due to sport hunting, but also especially because of the effects of climate change. So they were setting up blockades to prevent hunters from entering the park and hunting the moose. So I went up there to support them, and I actually almost died. Part of the tactics that the communities were using were to set off fireworks to warn off the moose from hunting areas. And one of my colleagues forgot to extinguish a firework and left it near a fuel canister. So yeah, that was fun, but that near-death experience was worth it because in April the following year, the Quebec government announced a moratorium on moose hunting. So it was a really successful campaign. And I think that story from the vantage point of communities is that's, a lot of people wouldn't think that that's a climate change story, but it's really about the effects of climate change and how communities are trying to adapt to the effects of climate change. And the story also shows me that a lot of the assumptions and foundations that we have about philanthropy, I think a lot of these are being discussed in the courses, is that I don't think those assumptions of philanthropy that we have mean that philanthropy is equipped to deal with climate change. A lot of the problems that I think Devika highlighted are a lot of the issues that are linked to philanthropy are also things that are linked to the cause of climate change. Things like colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, a bit of white supremacy, and a lot of the flaws that we see in philanthropy aren't well suited to dealing with climate change. Things like benevolence or saviorism that we're seeing in philanthropy. And especially around saviorism, the fight against climate change is not about saving the planet. Climate change is a justice issue. When we're looking at the yearly UN negotiations on climate change, there are three main topics that are often covered. Mitigation, which is about reducing emissions to fight climate change. Adaptation, how do we adapt to the effects of climate change? And increasingly, we're talking about loss and damage. There are a lot of small island nations where we're seeing sea level rise, and they're just going to completely lose their homes, their entire islands. And mitigation is what we often hear most talked about in traditional environmental and climate circles. But if we're focusing more on what is experienced in communities most affected by climate change, we need to talk a lot more about adaptation and loss and damage. And to do that, we need to not shift only our attention to adaptation issues and loss and damage issues, but also to shift resources to that. a lot of money, a lot of resources are going into mitigation efforts, electric cars to reduce emissions, but communities are feeling the effects of climate change right now, and we need to shift resources, money into those communities. And that's really, I think, also linked to another important topic of conversation around philanthropy, which is decolonization. Decolonization isn't about diversity, equity, inclusion. It's not about how many people of color you have on your board or how many projects of equity-seeking groups that you're funding. It's about how you're shifting those resources, the decision-making power into communities so that they are making the decisions of what works best for them. So if we look at the example of the case of the moose moratorium, the communities had to drop what they were doing and spend weeks on the front lines protecting the moose and their forests. And it's not just about those specific campaigns, but also making sure that the communities are resilient to these issues, that they have support for culture and language. So going back to Assembly of Seven Generations, they were sharing resources for the Indigenous youth in the communities to learn how to speak Anishinaabe, and that means when the youth were at the camps, they were able to communicate with their elders. And so circling back to loss and damage, we're thinking of adaptation, loss and damage. This means shifting resources, and that means thinking less about benevolence, but really about compensation, about restitution from the wealth that was stolen from these communities, that was built on stolen lands, and giving it back to these communities. And that is something that Indigenous communities have been telling us for decades, and that's land back, right? And to you, Susan.
Adding more to it. Aatif, you kindly shared some of the work that Northpine is doing in really shaking up philanthropy, approaching philanthropy in a very different way with a venture and a relationship model when you came to class this morning. So how would you approach philanthropy that might be doing this differently than traditional philanthropy, say?
Yeah, and I'm just going to start by saying Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. Very happy to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I see what I'll call capital P philanthropy. I'm new to the capital P philanthropy sector. I just started, January 2021. I've worked in a lot of different sectors, never philanthropy from a capital P before this. When I first started, I asked a very simple question, which kind of is a continuation from your point, which is, I came from this world most previously in what's known as like the entrepreneurship venture capital world. And I drew this analogy when they would define innovation. Lots of startup companies talk about being what they call customer obsessed. And it's not necessarily for good intentions per se, but it's because if the customer doesn't actually get value from what it is that you're creating, you fail. If they get value, you succeed. And any investor in you fails to succeed based off of you creating value for your end customer, your end beneficiary. And when I first came into philanthropy, the first question I asked myself was, how is it that I fail as a philanthropist? I could go and cut a bunch of checks to organizations, feel good about ourselves. I would have zero idea if how that's actually creating value for the actual mission that we have. And that's what kind of started the journey for me, I would say, in philanthropy. And I asked another question, which was, okay, I was like, how does the philanthropic business model work? And I think a lot in terms of business models as well. And what I found was, and some of the data that you'll find out there, is, for example, there's about just over 6,000 private foundations in Canada, about 5,000 public foundations. Those foundations manage about $92 billion annually in capital. Of that $92 billion, $7 billion is deployed into grants, And the other 85 billion, it's invested, mostly invested in traditional markets in order to get a financial return so you can grant out the other side. And to your point, the challenge that I internally had was our relationship as an organization to basically capital. Like, we have this power in money that we steward, and I personally felt very uncomfortable not having a relationship where that capital was deployed. And one of the first things we said is like, okay, well, you know what, we actually don't really want an endowment in the foundation. Instead, this doesn't mean we're a spend down foundation. We said, what is it that we can do? And then we looked at the CRA regulations, and then we learned, like, I used to think that all foundations could do was grant. And then I learned from a CRA perspective, actually you can grant, you can give loans, you can do equity investments, you can do all sorts of financial instruments, whatever you want really. Ironically enough, it's actually easier for me to invest on the asset side of foundations than to grant. There's actually exponentially more questions that the CRA would ask me about what I grant versus what I invest in. Who knows what I could be invested in on the other side, as long as I'm granting at this side. And that spurred an interesting thing for us. Whereas philanthropy, and I would say, and this is why I'll stop talking about philanthropy as a sector, because like I said, I'm new to it, so I feel uncomfortable speaking on behalf of others, because there's a spectrum of how philanthropy operates, so I'll talk about us, of how we operate. We said, okay, how is it that we can take this capital we have access to and basically be what we call catalytic or venture philanthropy? How do we help initiatives cross bridges or chasms to get from point A to point B on whatever it is that they're working on our focus areas? For us as Northpine, our focus areas include refugees, people exiting the prison system, those two are across Canada, rural development in Newfoundland Labrador, and then also climate. Those are the 4 focus areas. Inside of that, we realized, and it's kind of weird, we realized one of the most revolutionary things that we did as an organization is we gave our impact managers, it's their job is 100% to be accountable to impact. We gave them the right to not just do granting. We said use every financial instrument under the sun that you're allowed to use to get the best impact that you want. That's complicated. It requires a lot of creativity, but it actually opened up the doors of flexibility for us because it allowed us to think flexibly as long as we're being accountable to that impact. So when I think of like how is it that philanthropy engages on the climate side, for us, we actually just try to identify unique gaps or chasms that we can operate in a creative way to help, as Devika mentioned, like maybe philanthropy can play a part in crafting this new economy that we want to see, that no one can imagine just yet. And in some cases, one of our goals is to kind of come in and create a so-called synthetic economy. And you know, when you have philanthropy in Canada that's running, like managing close to $100 billion, our organization, we probably deploy between $30 to $50 million annually. Our goal is to figure out how can we use that money to basically cross chasms for ideas. And how do we work across the entire spectrum? There's value in so many angles. There's value in the advocacy side. The advocacy side, not only does it inspire ideas, it also helps build the political will to make things happen. That's critical. Once the political will is built and you have the inspired ideas, what's the next step? So we're always trying to figure out how is it that we kind of can inject ourselves in different areas. One of the other things that we do in our approach, I will say, to venture philanthropy, we call it relationship-based funding. And in that, we actually work with very few organizations, develop a deep relationship to help to get from point A to point B. Sometimes we don't know where that point B is, how we're going to get there, but we very much build a deep relationship with those organizations to get there. And what that means is beyond just money. It's those non-financial supports, everything that you do in a relationship with someone as you're working together on a common mission. So that's in a bit of how we operate. However, I will say that it's been extremely challenging. I'm 18 months in to philanthropy right now. It is a very challenging thing to do because we're out here trying to identify and build relationships, trying to figure out where makes sense for us. I do want to acknowledge for a quick moment, if Namendra, you can quickly raise your hand. So Namendra Nan is actually based here in Ottawa. I think just less than 1 month into his position right now, and he actually leads our climate portfolio. And this is what is on his mind, which is like, where do we even start? But more importantly, how do we start fast? Because we also don't want to go into analysis paralysis. And how is it that we just start building relationships and going from there? And it's a giant learning journey. So in terms of like when I think, how is it that philanthropy can engage on climate, I think there's a huge variety of ways that they can do it. That, to be honest, you don't even have to change many policies to do. Or in reality, you don't have to change any policies to do so many things in philanthropy right now. A lot of it is changing the will and changing even how organizations see themselves wanting to invest their time, effort. One of the challenges that I see is, even when we talk about disbursement quota in philanthropy, it went from 3.5% to 5%. But what that basically means to me is if you have 95% of your capital sitting out there in the financial market getting a 10% return so you can grant out 5% out the other side, for me as an engineer and some simple napkin math, it means that 5% you're granting out the side better have 20x value. Because how else would you justify having the rest banked over here in the traditional financial market? This is the journey that we're on right now. And more than happy to talk with many people about this as we're on this journey, but I'll end off there.
Great. Thank you, Aatif. And we'll have many questions for you. So James, you're working on some of the solutions. You're thinking about, what can we do to have impacts? So do you want to take it from there, please?
Yeah, hi. Nice to talk to you today. Sorry, I'm kind of have my back pointed to a good third of you. So over the last couple of years, I've actually had the opportunity to work with a number of charitable foundations in Canada that have financed the work that we've been doing. Particularly at Carleton, this group of foundations helped establish something called Efficiency Canada that works on energy efficiency, have supported the Transition Accelerator, which I'll say a little bit about more, which is basically trying to speed up the pace of change, to change our big systems that we have so that we can deal with the climate change problem. And soon will be announced, this is not the official announcement yet, but a climate change communication center based at Carleton that actually works on how do we talk to different social groups, from trade unions to doctors to lawyers to politicians, to communicate about the urgency of the climate change problem. And a series of Canadian foundations, the McConnell Foundation, Ivy Foundation, Troche Energy Foundation, about half a dozen more have very generously supported this work. The key thing I would say about it all is it's all practically focused on building solutions in the real world and using academic research only so much as it's a tool to transform what's happening out there in the world. And of course, research can help that process, but it's not a kind of end in itself. Unfortunately, as a couple of the speakers have I think, referred to, most Canadian foundations remain relatively conservative, I would say, traditional in their granting policies. They receive applications, they look at them, they dish out money to build extensions for hospitals, build a university building that gets named after them. It's great, and that's wonderful, but climate change requires something more urgent, more directed, and actually for foundations, to the extent possible, to get more actively involved working with partners to build things on the ground. So if we think about the climate change problem, there are many ways to do it, think about it. I'm not saying this is the only way, but the way we look at it is that our society today is very largely dependent on fossil fuels for 80% of our energy, but also key foundational materials of industrial civilization create lots of greenhouse gases. So making cement, smelting steel, creating aluminum, making plastic, and agriculture, all of those things produce greenhouse gases. Even if somehow you got a free energy that didn't produce GHGs, you'd have a problem. So 10% of emissions in Canada come from agriculture. This is actually related to manure, methane burps from cows, but also the use of chemical fertilizers, which are absolutely critical to the way we feed the planet today. So the foundations of our civilization, if you like, our development for the past 200 years rest on processes and practices that release GHGs, that absolutely can't avoid releasing GHGs. So getting off this track is not a simple thing. The good news is it is completely doable, and either we have the technologies already within reach, or they're reasonably accessible over a couple of decades. But the path dependence is very strong. There are material groups that are quite happy with the way things work because their lifestyle and affluence and profits, if you want to put it very plainly, depend on that. So it actually is it's not a trivial thing. So for us, really, the key thing is to focus on practical solutions. And the key to that is sectors and regions. In much of the political debate in Canada, we've approached this as a national challenge. Canada has to decarbonize its economy. The problem with this is the scale is too big, and it jumbles everything up together. Because what's going on in Quebec and Quebec's energy system is just completely different than Alberta, which is different than British Columbia, which is different than Ontario. You know, if you think about Quebec has hydro, the Ontario electricity system is heavily dependent on nuclear. Alberta, it's coal and gas mainly, not only. So different approaches, different technologies, different political alliances are required to deal with things and to build coalitions for change. It's also a sectoral problem. We have a carbon tax, or people call it about carbon pricing. That's good, cool. I'm not saying we shouldn't have that. But we have to realize that the conditions are completely different if you're talking about moving people around cities or you're talking about growing corn. Agriculture, the agri-food sector, is different than the built environment, is different than light-duty transport, is different than moving tons of grain and steel and heavy materials across the country. So the solutions have to be tailored to the pace of change in those individual sectors. And in particular, in some sectors, we have things that we can do and deploy at scale now that don't solve everything, but that make big leaps forward. And one of the problems, both with how governments often approach this, but also how philanthropy approaches is, we fiddle around the edges to do a little bit of everything because it makes everybody happy. But what we don't do is say, it's that problem, throw everything at it, and eliminate that problem. And the two, so since I'm talking here, and I will be talking partly technology, it's not only technology, because there's no technology without human behavior and power relations and all the rest. But two sectors that are ripe for rapid change right now is the electricity system. 80% of our electricity is already low carbon. It's not a big leap to completely eliminate fossil fuels from the electricity system and then double its size at least, so that we don't need gasoline for cars and we don't need natural gas for heating homes and so on. So electricity system. And the second thing, here I'll quibble a little bit, is the electrification of transport is absolutely critical. We have the technology for electric cars. We can knock gasoline out of our high streets, and that's important politically as much as it is in terms of tons of carbon. But it's an awful lot of tons of carbon as well. So about 12% of Canada's emission is gasoline in small, medium duty vehicles, our own, individual cars and small delivery vans. The other 12% in transport is heavy duty, those big trucks that roll by you on the highway. And that's another problem. That's diesel, and that's going to require slightly different solutions because the batteries aren't there. But right now, in the next 10 to 15 years at the outside, we could completely electrify light-duty transport. And think about how that changes the political game when people no longer care what the price of gasoline is because you actually don't need it and you don't use it. And it will dramatically reduce the strength of the fossil fuel lobby in Canadian politics. So electrify transport, drive fossil fuels out of the electricity system. These things can be done practically now. Now, there are other sectors. I'm not saying that's the only thing to do. I'm just saying that's two good examples. We have the technology. It's a question of driving it at scale. There are other sectors that we really are much more difficult to handle. I'll give you two. Aviation. So aviation is a big problem because we don't yet have electric airplanes. You often hear environmental campaigners talking about this sector. It's important. But, about 1.2% of Canadian emissions come from air travel. Okay, that's really difficult. And if we're going to net zero, we got to get rid of that. But compare that to the 12% that come from cars, where we already have the solution. So aviation will require a bunch of things. Maybe we'll use some biofuels while we develop electric and, and hydrogen fueled planes and so on. But don't put them all together in a big bunch, because some things we can do right now and do at scale and eliminate that segment. And again, I'm not saying EVs solve all transport problems. They don't. We need walking and we need biking and we need mass transit. But I can bet you anything you want to bet. In 15 years, there will be millions of cars on the Canadian roads, and they better be electric. And agriculture is another sector that's really, really hard. It's hard because it's different. Animal agriculture is different than grain, is different from raising fruit, which is different from dairy in Quebec. It's different regionally. Different soils change the way they do. So we need solutions there, but we're much more at the experimental stage to develop pilots, to try what works in Lac Saint-Jean and isn't going to be the same thing that's going to work in Southern Ontario, and so on and so on. So roping this back to philanthropy rather than just talking about climate change, unfortunately, so far, there are a number of Canadian foundations. The good side is that have really engaged. But many more are still hesitating on the edges. They kind of, as you suggested, want to do something, but maybe don't know exactly what. And very often we fall into the easy things that make nice posters, but aren't solving the problem. So nature conservation is really important. I completely agree. We need to protect and we need to plant more forests, and we need to protect wetlands. Okay, but the vast majority of the impacts that are going on vis-a-vis these landscapes is because of agriculture. It's agriculture that's taking up, the vast majority of our land area. It's the runoff of toxins, it's pesticides, it's artificial fertilizers, it's animal agriculture. So if you want to really engage with change, you have to actually get dirty on the ground and work and support farmers, develop innovation solutions there, develop pilot, not just say, we'll take this little bit of land and protect it, but it's all the land that's being used. We have to change the system, the way we farm. And it's the same with multiple other sectors. So I agree, electric vehicles use batteries. Mines produce carbon emissions. Well, we're going to need mines. But what we can do is electrify them so that the mining equipment doesn't produce carbon emissions. We can decarbonize steel production so the steel that goes into a car actually doesn't produce emissions. And the same with plastics and the same. So we don't do this, you hear lots of people, last rant, saying, EVs are terrible because after all, the Alberta grid has lots of coal on it, so you're not really doing such a big deal if you drive an EV. And, the battery's not so, isn't clean because they built the factory and that involves emissions, blah, blah, blah. Okay, true, but you're not going to solve this problem by waiting until everything is pure. Now we have completely non-problematic batteries. Now the Alberta gig is completely green. Oh, now let's talk about switching to electric vehicles. All these changes are going to take multiple decades. We need to be doing them all together in parallel. So ramp up the sale of EVs as we decarbonize the grid, as we force the steel makers and encourage them to change, because there are ways to produce steel that are low carbon, as we're transforming, multiple sectors. But you have to do things that are really going to make the difference and not dance around the edges because it makes us feel good. That's it. Thank you.
James, we know we can always count on you. So all of you have talked about scale in one sense and bringing others along. And James, you talked about not enough, all of you did in some, not enough philanthropic institutions getting involved. What's the barrier? Is it lack of knowledge, knowing how to do it? Is it not seeing the urgency? How do we push, encourage, incentivize, otherwise shame, if we have to, philanthropic institutions into doing more and doing it at scale? Devika, do you want to start? Anyone who wants to start.
Sure. I'm going to actually, I really want to respond to James. So, so I'm going to respond to your question and respond to James in the same way, at the same time. But so I think, absolutely, these solutions that have been outlined, they're not new. The work of the Smart Prosperity and Transition Accelerator, et cetera, is a little bit, it was done a while ago. And those solutions are new. And absolutely, the two biggest things that are ready to go are renewables and EVs. I totally agree. Why haven't they? So, because to me, this links to why philanthropy is not reacting, right? If the solutions are so clear and we just need to take it seriously and we need to invest significant capital, subsidize these industries to get them off the ground the same way the oil sands were subsidized 20 years ago, why haven't we? What's the barrier there, right? And I think, again, we're talking about a system that we're locked into where it's not, in our current economic system, it is not profitable to do those things. Like the capital that's required to do that in our current system, not enough people make enough money, and there's supposedly not enough money because it's being spent elsewhere. And so if you're a philanthropist and you're looking at, okay, the solutions are out there, why aren't they being scaled up? It's easy to go, well, okay, there's this massive system working in the opposite direction. What can my little philanthropic contribution do to actually shift an entire system that's baked in? So EVs are absolutely really critically important in a different economic system, but in the one that we're in, they actually, they contribute not enough to get to where we need to go. And in the same way, I just think, we have to recognize the complexity. If you just look at what are the solutions and what are the pathways, and this is all we need, but you're not looking at the psychological reasons behind why those solutions aren't being adopted, then you're missing half the equation.
And where would you have philanthropy start to address that part of the equation?
So I think that I agree with James that it is, we need philanthropic dollars on every aspect of the ecosystem. So we need, like the Clean Economy Fund, which is what James is referring to, is about 9 foundations that have come together and are funding the solutions pathways. I was advocating for that before it existed, and I was glad that it happened. We need that. We also need the public mobilization and the grassroots kind of piece. We also need, all those technology entrepreneurs who are investing billions of dollars, they're primarily focused on direct air capture. There's a lot of, so that's like actually physically removing carbon from the air that's already been emitted. We're at the stage that we're so far down right now that we actually need that as part of the solution as well. We need all of it, but I think the part that we really need is whichever solution we're focused on, challenging the economic system that we're sitting on, that this solution is supposed to flourish within, because it can't flourish. So that means when government says, well, we agree with you, but there's not enough money for that. Actually, there is enough money. You're just investing it here instead of here, because you have lobbyists that are you know, chasing you down that way, and you're not standing up to them. Or, you know, there's wealth taxation, and there's, you know, all kinds of economic solutions that need to be integrated into the climate solutions. We can't just ignore the economic system and just try to deal with climate independently.
Does anyone else want to respond to that?
I can't, of course, can't resist it. So actually, first thing, let me say, I completely agree. For large-scale social change, you need to be operating on multiple channels. You need smart lawyers tying people up in court. You need activists chaining themselves to the gates of factories. You need action on multiple levels. And I completely agree that the political terrain, talking with Canadians, frankly, about this problem and mobilizing so that politicians can't get away with some of the things they get away with now is really, really important. So I'm not taking away from that at all. You need all these levels to achieve change. I just think that, you know, we need to focus, and both our campaigns and the other levels of work, on the things where we can move stuff and put it out at scale now, because it gives us wins that strengthens the position then to move on and you know, move deeper. I personally I'm not sure about the value of getting into, I agree with all the problems that you said. There are lobbyists, there are powerful interests that don't want to make that change. But I do think that it's actually possible to outsmart them, to overcome them, and make certain changes. And they have. And there's both changes that take place in the marketplace, there are political things that take place, and the interactions between multiple forces, from civil society to entrepreneurs and markets, and the role played by states can actually you know, engineer some change. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I want to bring in place into this. The physical location of our largest foundations are overwhelmingly in Ontario and Quebec, and more specifically, they're in Toronto and Montreal. So if we're going to take a more of a place-based approach that looks at regions and sectors and dealing with things like forestry, how do we move into more of a place-sensitive approach? And Aatif, Northpine has been one that has taken some place-based systems change work seriously. So do you have how do we break out of thinking of some of the sectors and regions away from our own immediate home in the two largest cities and what we know in those cities, as opposed to thinking about differences by sector, by region, by place?
So maybe when I kind of think about the flow of capital, I center it all on relationships. So if you were to look at the geographic distribution of philanthropy across Canada, you will actually find philanthropy is disproportionately invested in Ontario, and not in places like Manitoba or Saskatchewan or Atlantic Canada. And it's likely because capital flows where relationships are. So if you have capital that doesn't have relationships built in with these underinvested areas, in my own opinion, you're not going to really drive investment in those areas, because there's actually no incentive to do so. When you kind of look at the flow of philanthropy, it goes back into my whole thing. It's like, how does a philanthropist determine success? Is it that you feel good about your donation? Is it the stories that you're told about it? That comes through a relationship. Or is it based off of actually finding an underserved, underinvested area and putting risky bets down? And so for Northpine, when we actually defined our populations, we actually started not with where do the charities lie that serve these people. We actually just started with the people first. We said, let's make a map of where all the formerly incarcerated people who've recently exited prison in Canada over the last 3 years, where are they in Canada? Where are all the refugees in Canada? Where do they live? And the hypothesis that we had was then we overlaid that with the proportion of philanthropic dollars that go in those regions. And we actually specifically targeted going to clusters where there were populations that were high that we wanted to focus on, and philanthropy investment was low. Because we had this hypothesis that where there's people, there's relationships, and when there's relationships, there's catalytic great leaders doing good stuff. We just didn't know who they were. And on the climate side, we're kind of on the same journey. Actually, Namendra and I just met this afternoon to chat about it, is like, where is it that the emissions are happening, but also where is it that the political will is happening, where could it be happening, and how that should be driving our direction. One of the others, again, this is a bit of a tangent, but the one thing I would say about what is philanthropy, philanthropy in Canada, as far as I understand it, is an investment firm. It's an investment firm established by the CRA that has to donate 5% of its capital annually to charitable purposes each year. The other bit, it's whatever it wants to do with it, basically. And that typically is defined by the board of how you want to do your investment thesis. So in my mind, the way philanthropy is laid out, I treat it like any other investment firm. Hence, how can we think creatively about investment? And I don't have an answer to that. If anyone has an answer to that, let me know.
Can I build on these two?
Yeah, I was just going to come to you and ask that.
So the perspective that I was sharing was on resourcing of communities. And to me, the barrier is, in terms of that, is around some of the things I was sharing earlier. So I like to hate on diversity, equity, inclusion because I don't think it's enough. And it's not enough. But that is the starting point, unfortunately. When we're looking at a lot of the issues like space, like who's showing up where, and about these issues as well of like these big discussions on systemic issues, a lot of those spaces are predominantly white. And I know, Devika, you know that because I've been talking with folks in the climate space, and they've been pointing out that is a huge issue. I know a lot of them are they're sensitive to those issues, but just looking at them at those spaces right now, they're still predominantly white spaces. And to change that, it's really about relationships, as you're saying, Aatif. It's making sure that the people who are in the rooms talking about those issues, making those decisions, come from communities. And it does start with ensuring diversity, equity, inclusion, but it's not just numbers. It's making sure that those people, those communities have the resources to participate and structuring the conversations and the ways that are much more accessible to them. And also thinking about how not just bringing those perspectives into the rooms that we're in, but also going out to those spaces and those communities and learning from what their experiences are, because they hold solutions as well.
Important point. Even if philanthropy invested at scale, philanthropy isn't going to be the solution on its own. So how do you see philanthropy working with governments? Are governments engaging with philanthropy as partners? Are philanthropic institutions reaching out and working with governments? What about that relationship? Can any of you provide your perspectives on where we're doing well, where we're not doing well, what more we needed to do in that important relationship? And I should add the private sector in there as well, but particularly with governments.
I'll start.
You start.
So I think some philanthropic organizations are trying to actively, they lobby, they have GR people who, and I think they're really quite effective. I know in some cases, so maybe people don't know that, but the government of Canada is somewhat dysfunctional in the sense that different ministries do different things, and they don't even always know what they're doing. And one role that a philanthropist I know has told me is we see ourselves as running between the ministries and telling them, well, if you could just get together with the industry and you could do this, and then NRCAM would want to do that. And so, I mean, there are things like that which actually do kind of can help bring initiatives together, or deviate money so it goes into more, state money, government money, so it goes into more useful things. I mean, I think one thing, so I'd make a pitch that I think there's more to be done around communicating with the public about climate change, but communicating in a way that makes it concrete for people how they can actually act to help change things. Not individual aid in the sense of say, you know, it's your tons sort of that you need to deal with. But nevertheless, besides being politically active, there are things that people can do. And the debate is artificially skewed. So let me just give an example that is kind of obvious. So you talk to people even who know quite a lot about the climate, and you say, oh, do you have a gas furnace? And they say, well, yeah, of course. So you say, well, you realize we can't have gas furnaces if we're going to net zero. You know, and more than that, if we want to make any kind of the 2030 targets, something like 30 to 40% of Canadian homes have to get rid of natural gas, and you know, basically in a decade, if you believe the government. That discussion of natural gas, that's an impossible discussion. It's been eliminated politically. And here I completely agree with your point. I mean, some of you may remember 15 years ago, an Ontario Minister of Energy did a memo in which they said we should think about stopping installing natural gas furnaces in new builds if we're serious about climate change. That lasted, you know, not even 36 hours before the minister was groveling. It was an internal memo by some low aide that didn't in any way reflect what the government was thinking about. This was a Liberal government. I think it was actually the under McGuinty, because the gas industry just bailed in and said, you're going to make homes impossibly expensive for Canadians, the heating bills will double, it's terrible, and the government caved. So I mean, just some very simple things. You can't go to net zero climate gases if we have end uses of fossil fuels in our homes. So it's not a thing that you can do like that. It's expensive replacing a furnace. I get all that. And yet, actual household energy use is some minuscule percentage of the cost of home ownership. Canadians spend less than 5% of their household budgets on energy. It may be up to 8 now because the gasoline price has gone up. It's a very small part. And compared to the, you know, we're paying these enormous mortgages on our houses, the cost of heating is really, really small, which is not to say there isn't fuel poverty and inequality, and we need programs to address it. But that's just an example of a debate that you can't have at the present time. And even the federal government, you know, they've just released an emissions reduction plan. There is one sentence buried in there that says the government will think about regulating combustion heating in relation to buildings. And it's buried in pages of discussion of energy efficiency, home retrofits, better insulation, because they're just some things that we can't say. And if we can't say these things frankly, then it's hard. You know, and foundations can help because they can actually say them, or support groups that will say them. So we bring them into the public debate so we can engage with them.
So could I just add something on the question of foundations' relationship with the private sector and government? And I would actually say foundations have a very deep relationship with the private sector and government if you're to look at the fact that 90% of their capital is invested in bonds and equities, which is typically private sector or government-run bonds, et cetera. But the question is the purpose. If that same size has the purpose of what's happening on what I call the impact side of the foundation, which is so-called the granting side. So when you have this deep relationship where 90% of your capital is invested in bonds and equities, and the CFO of a foundation is only questioned on managing the financial return, being like, can I keep that financial return at 9 to 10%? And that relationship isn't asked the same question of purpose, which is what's happening in those bonds and equities? How is that actually helping what it is that we're trying to do? I think we have the and I say we, the collective we, but we don't even have an endowment. We do a terrible job of setting one up now. But I think it's the purpose of, and I keep focusing on the capital that foundations hold, because I find so much of the time we're talking about a small sliver of what philanthropy does, which is the granting. And that's a very, very small sliver of what these organizations do. Yeah.
If I just respond to the government thing, I think there's a lot of ways in which philanthropy and government can work together. Sometimes, it often depends on which government's in power, right? And so when you think about our current federal liberal government, for me, this was the thing that was kind of a pivotal moment. My former colleagues are all, not all, but many of them are in this government. They are in the ministry. Like the best people I know, the smartest people I know who can solve these problems are on the other side for the first time. And the relationship that has existed now between the environmental movement, whether it's the funders or the NGOs and government, is unprecedented. Like you can just text people because you already had their number in your phone from before. And you can say, hey, how do we move this file along? And yet, there's still a lot of constraints. They're constrained. And so they will often say, like, we're calling in the reinforcements. Like, we need you to create the pressure out there so that we can move forward with the solution. Can you please, do that? And so there's a lot of that behind the scenes coordination that people don't know about that happens. Sometimes it's adversarial. Sometimes, it's governments that are even more progressive than previous governments being called out for not doing enough by their former colleagues. And sometimes that's important and you need to create. So there's the good pressure and there's the bad pressure. Sometimes there's, like the government recently released a fund, the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund, which is about conservation in ecosystems that are large carbon sinks. They are granting to those areas and requiring matching funds. They actually coordinated with us to reach out to some of our conservation funders to say, okay, let's share applications so you folks can come in and match, and we can actually leverage the dollars to actually have greater impact. So there's that function as well. And then there's the direct ad. I think I totally agree. I mean, I've seen many funders have to just run back and forth between ministries, explaining to them who they should talk to in government because they don't talk to each other. There's a lot of dysfunction in government. So there's a lot of different roles, and it's really important. One role that I think we probably don't play enough is actually the direct advocacy role. We kind of are behind the scenes and we fund others, but as a sector, we have a lot of relationships. It is it's a very white elitist world, and if those relationships are there, we might as well use them and actually do some direct advocacy as well.
I'm sure Nathan is clapping at that. Let me turn to questions from the audience, and I'd ask you to briefly identify yourself and then actually ask a question.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Inrig with the Sustainable Capacity Foundation. And I loved what you said, James. You've come up with, well, you haven't come up with them, but there are two very obvious solutions. And we've talked about the ability to unlock capital potentially. We're a 100% impact investment foundation, and that's just the nature of how we were created. But it feels like we're a bit of a unicorn in the philanthropy sector. And when I talk to other foundations, it's sort of like they're dipping their toe in the water of impact investing. And we're talking, of that $100 billion of big P philanthropy, less than 5 billion is probably being deployed in the way that we're talking, maybe even 3 billion. I don't know if you have a better number, but it feels like it's not enough. It's not very much. So how can we turn the tides on that? And to me, the question of risk is really a question that seems to get pushed back all the time in how can we be comfortable taking that risk as foundations. And so I know there's lots of great leaders in the sector that are doing this work very actively, but it feels like it's happening so slowly. Only 10 years ago, I think that one of the McConnell Foundation reports about Canadian impact investing was talking like, here's $3 million or here's $10 million in impact investing that's happening. But what is going to accelerate the pace of going from 5 billion invested in impact philanthropy to 95 billion? And how do we make that transition? How do we do the transition accelerator that James is talking about for impact investing? So more toward the foundation side, because I'm all in, but I'm a small foundation, so it's not going to make a big impact. What about the big dollars?
And an MPNL grad.
Oh yes, and an MPNL grad.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a crack at it. I talk a lot about the philanthropy business model, but I understand why they do it and the system they exist in. I'll go on a bit of a rant right now, which is to say philanthropy exists as well, they see themselves to exist as a key pillar to invest in the community sector, or i.e. the third sector. The reason, and this again, opinion, the reason why I think the philanthropy sector focuses on capital in perpetuity, i.e. having this money invested over here so you can continue to make money to grant out the other side, is because they see that as being valuable to continue to grant out to enable the community sector to exist. I come from a climate innovation background, is one of my backgrounds. I actually find it easier to craft impact investments on climate innovation than on some of the social impact areas that, for example, we focused on. So what you do find is foundations, or if you're able to find the right investments that give you either the right returns or the right investment portfolio characteristics, i.e. the liquidity, i.e. how much, like if you want to grant out stuff on the other side, can you actually get access to that money on your investment side to grant out on the other side? If you have the right portfolio characteristics on the asset side, a foundation may be willing to do it. Now, the climate investment world is booming compared to the social investment world. Because in the same way, so we do climate, but we also do social impact. So for example, Canada spends $80,000 to $150,000 annually to incarcerate people, yet we know that we can get better solutions for $50,000 a year. But that's just nice words on paper. In reality, there's no investment to be done there because that investable asset doesn't exist. On the climate side, there's actually a huge investment market of climate investments. And I think a lot of it's a bit of education and awareness for portfolio change. Sometimes many of these foundations just go to a wealth advisor or to a bank that manages their funds and they hope that they have it figured out. It's actually not the philanthropy foundation that's figuring it out. It's the wealth manager that's managing their funds that's figuring it out. So they, as a wealth manager, they need to figure out how they could differentiate themselves among every other wealth manager that the foundation will want to invest in them. And then it becomes a bit of a marketing tactic for the wealth manager. So I actually think on the climate side, it's an easier road than the social impact side. I think a lot of it is, are we hitting on the right levers, which I think are going to be the people who actually define what portfolios look like, which actually isn't people in the foundations. It's people likely in banks and investment portfolio managers that kind of define that out. Yeah.
Anyone want to add to that, or
I'll quickly say, like, my answer to that question, how do we ramp that up, is peer pressure. Peer pressure is a very important currency in our sector, and that's partly why, we're looking at, we want to sort of band together with PFC and CFC and the others and kind of push for sector transparency, just so everyone understands, like, this is what's happening currently. This is what your peers are doing, and to create that peer pressure to move things further along. And it is often investment firms that are dealing with this, but there's still a role for philanthropy to demand more of their investment managers, and that's a lot of work. And to do that, you have to be a little bit named and shamed to be like, okay, we're supposedly in the climate space, but we're actually using 95% of our capital to do things that don't support climate, and now everyone knows it, so I better call my investment manager and yell at them.
Jonathan?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Harleen. I'm in the 10th cohort of the MPNL program, and Devika, you said something that kind of struck a chord with me. You said regenerative economics, and I've done a bit of a dive into Post-Capitalism by Paul Mason and the Zero Marginal Cost Society by Jeremy Rifkin. So I was kind of wondering if there could be more comment maybe on what comes, like how can we agitate for a quicker regenerative economic model and what that would maybe look like?
Yeah, so it's like, as we talk about climate, we talk about this massive toolkit of solutions that, James talked about. There's so many different pieces. Even just within kind of chipping away at our current economic model, I think, I'm still learning about this myself, but from what I'm reading, there's so many different tools. Part of it is pushing back, pushing back against the narrative that, we need this we need to, invest all this money to lure this company to put their headquarters here because it's going to create jobs. Actually challenging, how many jobs is it going to create for that level of investment? What would that same amount of money do if we built some sort of community-owned renewable energy operation? Like what are who gets what? Like, let's challenge this narrative of, we make 5 people rich and somehow all those crumbs are going to support us all. Let's actually build new kind of local inclusive models. So a lot of it is about community mobilizing for how capital needs to be used in their communities, I think. A lot of it is, a wealth tax. We definitely need to change the taxation system. We have all the money we need. It's just how it is, where it is distributed and how it's sitting. Some of it is basic income guarantees because you need certain foundations to have enough to create kind of the foundation that's required for people to be able to respond. You need, climate job guarantees, for example. If we were paying people to do, energy efficiency and restoration, ecological restoration and those kinds of things, we are shifting the way capital is being used. And so I think a lot of it is just, asking ourselves, and a lot of it is about degrowth, because we have to actually accept that continuously expanding, continuously using more resources than we have. Today is Earth Overshoot Day, meaning that if we're acting like all the resources that we can actually use in 1 year, we've used by today. So if we need to backtrack and say, okay, what can we actually produce? How much do we actually need? And what does that mean? It does mean a change in lifestyles. It does mean a 4-day work week. It does mean reprioritizing how we live. And there is, it does have implications. It's not just about yelling at government. It does mean that, we have to be willing to embrace things like, okay, we're all going to fly once a year now instead of multiple times a year. And we're actually not going to penalize whichever politician tries to bring that forward. It's all of these different pieces put together. So I'm rambling right now because I don't have a coherent answer, but I think it's so complex. I just think that in everything we do, there's an opportunity to always ask, how is that narrative dominating right now that's so baked into our DNA, and how can I challenge that? So if you're advocating at the government level for these renewable energy solutions that James is talking about, and they say, well, we don't have enough money, challenge, how much money did you actually put into the fossil fuel sector this year in subsidies? It's like 10 times. So we have the money. It's that constant challenge.
Great. Tim,
Can I quick note this?
Sure. Sorry.
Just a very quick note, because it's not my area of expertise, but so we can't forget that, you should remember that Western capitalism is just one specific model of economy that exists in the world. There are a lot of different economic models as well. And you mentioned listening to communities, a lot of communities have these economic systems that are much more based on reciprocity and relationship with land, good relationships with the environment. So my organization, Indigenous Climate Action, last year hosted an Indigenous Economics Conference. So I think it's on our website. So that is not my area, but I think that's a great resource to check out as well.
Tim, over to you.
Hi, my name is Tim Broadhead. I'm a retired philanthropist. Thanks, first of all, to the panelists. It was a really interesting, rich discussion. Brought up a lot of ideas, a lot of things I'd love to pursue. One thing which just caught my attention was the comment that, 10 years ago when impact investing was first talked about, there was a reason why it was so little in Canada, and that was that CRA wouldn't allow it. Even the YMCA got called on the carpet because they were running a health club, even though the proceeds of the health club subsidized the free programs they were running for young people in the community. So that was a change that came about, and it was pressure brought by foundations and others, and particularly by the leadership of people in the United Kingdom. There's a misperception because we constantly talk about philanthropy and social change as though foundations, as the key institutional embodiment of philanthropy, were progressive forces. This is simply not true. Foundations are deeply conservative, and I think Aatif's presentation has explained why. Because most of their capital, 90%, is invested in the stock market and therefore deeply committed to maintaining the status quo. And the other, and only for some foundations, the granting budget may be devoted to what people refer to sometimes as systems change, although I think that's a ludicrously ambitious term for what most funders are doing. But nevertheless, it's pretty clear if the bulk of your concerns are how do we make the stock market more successful so that our returns, and particularly, as you said, the wealth managers who are competing for this business can demonstrate a high rate of return, then you have a contradiction built right into your basic structure. We have a model in front of us of how you bring about the kind of change we've talked about in relation to climate. It's not in relation to climate, it's the United States and the way in which the right-wing political forces organized and over a period of 40 years systematically invested in an entire ecosystem, which included research bodies, universities, the legal profession, of course, state bodies, political institutions. They brought about a real revolution because they invested, as Devika has just said, in all the different aspects of how you have to bring pressure to bear. And it was done because the sense of purpose that the foundations, like the Koch brothers, for example, and others, their sense of purpose was absolutely laser focused. And they were prepared to invest for 40 years to see the changes that we now are witnessing right in front of us. So the question I have for the philanthropy movement in Canada is, A, is there enough clarity about the need for this focus, this purpose? Two, is there a willingness to do the coordination, the kind of long-term commitment to collaborate on building a whole ecosystem which will support the kinds of ideas that we've heard this evening? If there isn't, then I don't see, frankly, that we're going to have much chance of success. But we have to fight against this notion that philanthropy is all about individuals. It's about the total discretion people have to allocate their money, which, by the way, is not their money anymore because it's been given. So if they're willing to sacrifice some part of that personal discretion to collaborate with others, or are willing to simply accept that the magnitude of the task ahead of us requires that we coordinate in a truly effective fashion, then we might see some progress. But I have to admit, I'm not terrifically optimistic.
Well said. We are more or less running out of time, and I'm not sure how one would answer to him. Because it gave us too much to think about. But let me give you each 1 minute to leave us with a final thought. And we'll go in a different order than we started. Nathan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I had a question to ask for this. So has anyone heard of the podcast How to Survive the End of the World by Adrienne Marie Brown? It's an amazing podcast. And the premise, I love the premise of the title, is that communities of color have been surviving end-of-the-world events for centuries. Events like genocides, wars, slavery, residential schools that really created traumatic effects on communities. And so, I think that's the approach that we're looking at in terms of the issue of climate change, the issue of deep transformation for societies. There's a concept called carbon fundamentalism that I think a few of folks here have referred to, which is that the most important thing, according to carbon fundamentalism, the most important thing is to reduce carbon emissions at all costs. But climate change is not a math problem. And I think as we learn as well, COVID as well is not a math problem. It's not just about reducing emissions or reducing case counts. It's about figuring out how do we show up as community together so we can survive through really difficult, traumatic, challenging times. And that's what we need to look at in terms of philanthropy. How do we use the resources to build stronger communities to get through these really difficult times?
Well said. Devika, do you want to pick up your point?
Yeah, and it's a little bit in response to what Tim said. I think the solutions, we don't have that like laser focused, very specific thing that we're trying to all accomplish that, we can all get on the same page and do. Because to Nathan's point, there are lots of different things that people care about. It's easy when all you want to do is make money. Then it's easy to be laser focused. But when you care about all of these different things and you're looking at complex systems, it's hard to have that shared focus. So I don't think that our answer is going to be replicating what the right did. I think that it's actually going to be, it's going to be, I know this sounds really weird to say in a university in a setting like this, but it's actually a spiritual transformation and a cultural transformation. And either it happens or it doesn't. I was on a call earlier today with a bunch of funders, and there was an Indigenous community leader on the phone, and she said that in her culture, their prophecies say that we're now in the, I think, 8th era or something, where the humans are facing a choice: materialism or spirituality. And the prophecy says if they pick materialism, they're going to die, and if they pick spirituality, they'll survive. That's where we are right now. I will admit that there are most days I don't have faith that we're going to pick the right path. But every once in a while, I think maybe it's possible. But I think it's going to be an emotional, it's not going to be logical. It's going to be an emotional shift that happens with a critical mass. With George Monbiot's 25%, if we can hit that 25%, that enough of us shift at that kind of deep emotional, spiritual level, we might have a chance out of this. We might be able to respond with that sense of purpose. And if not, we won't. And the earth will be fine, but we won't.
James, over to you.
Well, we really seem to be getting into like broad scale conclusions. Well, so I've been involved with climate change for more than 30 years. And I must say that on one hand, things are extremely slow, but on the other hand, there actually is really rather rapid progress on many sectors. If 15 years ago people had said, oh, we can have solar power and it'll be cheaper than gas and coal, they would have thought that you were nuts. But that is the case today. Electric vehicles are already on most accounts cheaper than internal combustion cars. You can't get them if you go to the showroom because they're going to tell you it's 11 months wait and so on. But there are many, many changes that are happening. We're going to decarbonize our society. We're going to head to net zero. Is it going to be in time? Probably not. So, maybe it's going to be pretty bad for a couple of billion people. Could it be much worse? Yes, it could be bad for another couple of billion people. So I would just say I don't like this thing about speaking about climate change like it's a train that's leaving the station. So back at Paris, people said we've got 10 years left to solve the problem. Well, now we're down to like 7.5 or whatever it is. It isn't like a train leaving a station. There are, it's better to act today than it is to act tomorrow, but it's better to act tomorrow than the day after tomorrow, and better to act the day after tomorrow than 3 days. Yes, there are tipping points, but we've already passed some tipping points, and we will only harvest the results of that in a decade or two or more, and they're already baked in. So my point is, button down and actually do the work. And I agree completely with your point. I don't think we're going to unite all the foundations in a kind of complete common front. There are multiple problems, there are multiple layers of solution, and I think we have to kind of embrace that complexity and dig down and change things as deep as we have to go in order to right the wrongs and to engage with the problems as best we can.
Aatif, last word to you.
Be kind, be authentic, build relationships. I actually did have a last word figured out, and Devika got like my pastor mode now unlocked, because I was actually like, as you said that, I'm like, well, why do I care about this? Why am I even here? And it is, for me, it is spirituality. And this is from a very personal piece for me, because me being a Muslim, the way that I was raised and my thoughts is everything around me, human, animal, nature, will be a witness for or against me on the day of judgment. That's a very personal side of me. At the end of the day, to be honest, I can like live and die on this earth. I cannot make a dent, but I see it as my duty to kind of leave it all on the field and do something with the time that I have here. And I kind of go back into that whole thing of be kind, be authentic, build relationships, because everyone is going to have their own angle in how they attack this problem, as long as we're all kind of guided towards solving the same problem. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you all. You gave us so much to think about, and please join me in expressing our appreciation. And please join us for some refreshments out in the hallway. I think the balcony may be open too if you prefer the open air setting in these days. Thanks to all.